do you think that there are legitimate concerns coming from last season about whether he's going to be, of course, he did not have a disastrous season. He still threw one pick, right? Finished
He
with
wound
one
up with
pick.
2 because he threw another one in the bowl game. But yeah,
Okay.
two interceptions across 13 games in your first year as a starter.
Sure.
I mean, that's impressive. I don't care how you spin it. That's impressive.
Yeah, even if you say, "Oh, he's too conservative," and they check down all the time. Regardless, yes, it's impressive. So I don't want to make too much of this, but I think there are a lot of people, and I will include myself in focusing on the two most important games and the two toughest defenses they faced. Uh, well, we could include Iowa, but I'll look at Ohio State and Michigan, of course. That yeah, he didn't look great, and he looked a little overwhelmed at times. So, is there any what you would consider legitimate concern that he's not going to turn out to be what people wanted him to be?
I mean, I don't know. Obviously, you're going to have some concerns because you saw some of the areas he struggled this year. But at the same time, I mean, you mentioned the struggles against Michigan and Ohio State. And I remember watching the Ohio State game in particular, just pulling my hair out over the game plan. And then against Michigan, it was much of the same. And the day after the Michigan game, Mike Yurcich is fired. So, how much of that was the game plan? And I remember in James Franklin's post-game press conference after the loss against Michigan, he made a comment that I forget exactly how it was worded, but it was something along the lines of, hey, we discuss stuff all week in practice. Here's what we run. And then we get the game day and that's not what our game plan looks like. Retail was pretty clear. Mike Yurcich and the rest of the offensive coaches weren't on the same page. And, less than 24 hours later, Yurcich was relieved of his duties. So I am curious to see with Drew, really the biggest issue this year, in my opinion, with him was that lack of aggressiveness, pushing the ball down the field. He's got the arm talent to do it. He did a pretty good job of going through his reads. He did a pretty good job pre-snap, especially for a first-year starter, on identifying defenses, audibling, calling out blitzes, things of that nature. Now, sometimes he would get a little happy feet in the pocket, and sometimes he'd hold the ball too long. But again, how much of him holding the ball too long also stemmed to this receiver crew that, we've talked ad nauseum about on here. So I do think there's some concerns about, does he have that mindset of, the grip it and rip it, trust your arm, that sort of thing. But I also think if he gets better wide receiver play this year, which, I mean, Mark, we talked about it when I was on last week, you're already seeing the positive impacts of Julian Fleming in that room. Players are already raving about the leadership and the guidance he's providing that wide receiver room. And I know I mentioned it with you last week where that allows you to bump Keandre Lambert-Smith to the slot where he's much better suited. I think just those two things alone can really improve the wide receiver room. And one thing, too, with Andy Kotelnicki, one thing he did a tremendous job of with his offense at Kansas was building it around the strength of his players. And again, after Yurcich was fired, there was a comment by James Franklin about, we need to use guys at what they're best at, not what we want to use them as. And that is something Kotelnicki did a tremendous job of at Kansas. So I think getting him at the helm can help as well. And I will be curious, though, from a quarterback coaching standpoint. I don't think they've made it official, but it seems the new quarterbacks coach is going to be Danny O'Brien. If that name sounds familiar, he was a starting quarterback in Maryland in the 2010s and then went to Wisconsin for a year. James Franklin was the offense coordinator at Maryland, and by all accounts, he's a rising star in the coaching industry. And I think a big reason why he's getting this promotion is because his time as a grad assistant is done, and Penn State doesn't want to lose him. And he's a guy that the quarterbacks really talk highly about. So now that he will kind of have the full reins of coaching these quarterbacks and working with them in terms of, pocket presence, footwork, stuff like that, I'll be curious to see the impact that makes. So I do think there's reasons to be somewhat concerned about Drew. And like you said, it's being concerned about reaching these expectations, right? If he would have came in as a mid to high 3-star the way Sean Clifford was and had that season, we're probably not even having this conversation. You're saying, man, look, he had a great year, first year starter, but when you come in as, 5-star by some services, arguably the number one overall player in the country, that brings a certain type of expectation. And, obviously those expectations weren't met last year, but I do wonder and do think a lot of that stemmed from a combination of the wide receiver room and the just conservativeness of Mike Yurcich, and in turn, Mike Yurcich not trusting the wide receiver room.
When you said grip it and rip it, the first thing I thought of was the most impressive moment that I can think of for me with Allar this past season was after he throws his first pick of his career and Indiana tied the game or took the lead. I don't remember. Tied the game. Yes. Which they should have went for it. And anyway, that's another story. Tom Allen, that's why he doesn't have a job, because it doesn't understand.
Tom Allen goes for
it. He has a job.
He might not be Penn State's defense coordinator.
He has a job.
Yes. Well, he doesn't understand the moment. You got to seize it at Happy Valley. But anyway, that he comes back out onto the field having thrown his first interception in his life at that level, and then he rips that missile down the sideline to win the game. Well, Tim, I got to say that between you two, looking at Penn State and USC, for as much of a traditionalist and purist as I am, and I don't like this mixing of the conferences, these kind of games will be the ones where I'll be like, this is cool, because once this happened, I thought, of that matchup, and this was certainly one of those that I was like, that's going to be really awesome.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. And I'll tell you what, Marty, I'm really happy it's not at Beaver Stadium, because I like the games that are played in California and not the ones that are played in Happy Valley, because in the mid-90s, the phrase woodshed came out a couple times. So I'm really happy that we are playing at home. But speaking of Tom Allen replacing Manny Diaz, what is he going to have as far as, like, you guys had a great defense last year. What are you guys losing, and what is Tom Allen going to have to work with?
Yeah, I'm going to be very curious with Tom Allen how this works, because he always had at Indiana. I mean, the overall statistics may not have looked great, but anyone who watched the Tom Allen defense, those defenses played hard. They were well coached. They were sound, and a lot of times the stats will, of course, they were, because in the fourth quarter, Indiana's offense just couldn't. They had nothing left, and the defense got gassed as a result. So I would be very curious to see a Tom Allen defense with this much talent, because I think he's always been a defensive coach who likes to be able to put his corners on an island and get aggressive. And I think at Penn State, that's going to be a lot easier to do because I have a lot more talent. Penn State does lose a decent amount off this defense. You lose your top three cornerbacks in Kalen King, Johnny Dixon, and Daquan Hardy. Obviously, everybody knows Chop Robinson. Deza Isaac, also a defensive end who's currently blowing up the Senior Bowl. And once he's someone who's going to crush the combine and may sneak in the back end of the first round of the draft as well. But you at linebacker are going to be very good. Abdul Carter is, I think, going to be an absolute just beast in Tom Allen's defense. And even at defensive end, you lose at least one, potentially two first-round picks, and you have a former five-star and denied Dennis Sutton, who's probably on his way to being a first-round pick, stepping in ready to go. Amin Vanover, who honestly, each of the last two seasons would have been a starting defensive end on a lot of defenses in the Big Ten and was just buried in this room. And Zariah Fisher, who is a guy they're very high on from Aliquippa. And I mean, Aliquippa is one of the best high school programs, not just in Pennsylvania, but really in the country. So there's still a lot of talent there. In a cornerback, you're young, but there's some young guys in that room, Zion Tracy, Elliott Washington, Cam Miller, that they're extremely high on. And like we talked about last time I was on, Mark, you bring in A.J. Harris, who is one of the best cornerbacks in the transfer portal. You bring in Jalen Kimber, who's going to give you some good experience there. And nothing else, Terry Smith has proven to be one of the best cornerback coaches in the country in terms of development. So it's quickly become a position you just don't worry about, because as long as Coach Terry's here, they're going to figure it out. So I think this defense can be very good again. I think this defensive line can be very good. The fact that they were able to keep Devon Ellies and Hakeem Beamon, who both seem ready to go pro, and we're able to get them to come back for one more year, really solidifies DT. And like I said, you think of a Tom Allen defense, you always think, there was Michael McFadden. There's just always that linebacker who is just all over the field causing havoc. And I'm very excited to see Abdul Carter, who is probably the most athletically gifted player Tom Allen has ever coached, be able to play that role. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I think Carter is going to be in line for a huge season. Recruiting, obviously, always going on. They've had junior days each of the last 2 weekends, have another one coming up this weekend. Picked up their first, or I shouldn't say first, offensive line commit of the cycle and out of the junior day 2 weekends ago, and Owen Alicine, their first true offensive lineman, though, because there's Brady O'Hara, who is listed as a tight end from North Catholic in Pittsburgh, who most likely will wind up an offensive tackle. But with Alicine, they get their first true offensive tackle commit of the cycle. Today was a busy day for James Franklin on the road. He had the helicopter out all over the region, visiting a lot of top targets. So just in the world of college football, where there truly never is an off season due to recruiting, and especially now with the transfer portal and things of that nature. It's just recruiting heavy right now.
Who's your backup quarterback going to be?
Bo Pabula, I would assume, unless something unforeseen happens. I think one thing with Andy Kotelnicki coming in to run the offense now, one thing he did a good job of at Kansas when Jalen Daniels was healthy was finding a way to incorporate both him and Jason Bean also, and I think Bean and Pabula are very similar players. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a little bit more 2 quarterback sets this year to throw a wrinkle into the offense, give opposing defenses something else to have to worry about on film. And with Pabula, as we saw this year, I mean, while he has his limitations as a thrower, he is a great runner. He could be a great weapon in the red zone with that. So I think Bo will, again, barring something unforeseen, Bo will be the backup, and I think we will see him used a little bit more in the fall, just based off of Andy Kotelnicki's track record at Kansas. I think he'll find a way to try and incorporate him into the offense a little bit more.
Is there a stud quarterback that James Franklin and company are after for 2025?
They currently have a high 3-star Beckham Kritza in the class from Colorado. If you watch Kritza's film, the tools are there. It's effortless arm strength. Now the footwork needs some work. I think his delivery could use some work. His release point, his pocket presence. But those are a lot of things that with young quarterbacks need to work on. But they plan on being a 2-quarterback class. You come back into the region, and the 2 main targets are Matt Zollers from Springford High School in Pennsylvania. That was one of the players Franklin was out visiting today. His recruitment has really started to explode in recent weeks. Georgia has offered. He was down to Georgia for a visit, and Notre Dame has offered. So he's starting to emerge from just being a regional prospect to being one of the more sought-after quarterback recruits in the cycle. And there's also Malik Washington at Archbishop Spalding High School in Maryland, who they've recruited pretty heavily. It definitely seems at this point Zollers is kind of distancing himself from Washington in terms of their preference, in terms of their quarterback board. And I mean, part of that again was Zollers being an in-state kid. I will say with Zollers, obviously, anytime Georgia gets involved in a recruitment, you're in for a fight if it's a kid Georgia wants, and it seems like if they don't. Right now, Georgia's top quarterback target continues to be Juju Lewis. I mean, I don't know how that recruitment's going to shake out. Will he flip? Will he not? I'm sure. I was expecting the head shake, but would say, assuming he stays committed to USC, I think it seems Georgia would definitely be interested in pursuing Zollers pretty heavily. But Zollers comes from a very pro-Penn State family. His grandfather has had season tickets for like 50 years or something like that. He's grown up going to games. So even if Georgia decides to get involved pretty heavily, which looks possible, you still feel pretty good there. I mean, is it like I said, he's a kid in your backyard. He's grown up going to games. His family's very pro-Penn State. So I think Zollers is their best bet at getting that, quote unquote, like big time game changer type quarterback for 25. And he had really good junior film. As I said, he started to blow up the spring. If he continues this trajectory he's been on, and Penn State does land him, from Drew Allar and then Ethan Grunkemeyer this past cycle, who wound up a top 100 recruit at some places in a consensus 4-star, and then Zollers, you'd be looking at 3 out of 4 cycles with landing, 3 of the best based on talent quarterbacks that James Franklin has landed. And, that can go a long way towards getting Penn State across that playoff hump finally.